So thank you, everybody, for not only taking time out to join us in this conversation, but by joining, we understand that you are standing up and committing to learning how to be an anti-racist. And for that, we are very appreciative. So welcome. I'm Dr. Lori Stevick-Rust. I am a clinical health psychologist, author, and speaker. And it is my distinct privilege to introduce Dr. Deborah Plummer, who is an internationally recognized psychologist, university professor, author, and speaker, and a diversity thought leader on topics central to racial equality, inclusion, and mutual respect. Debbie was named by Becker's Hospital Review as one of the top 15 chief diversity officers to know. And I will proudly add that over the past 40 years, she has been my teacher, my advocate, and my friend. Whenever anybody asks Debbie how we met and how we got together over these 40 years, Debbie usually will say, we went to school together. So I'm here to say that, yes, in fact, we did go to school together. Debbie was my high school teacher and went on through my college years as being my advocate, my mentor, and teaching me through those 40 years of friendship on how to do some good self-examination, how to look at myself and authentically show up with my racial bias, my ideas, my prejudice, my gifts fully exposed to have those deep and meaningful conversations. And so particularly today, while we are in such a divided, stressful, hate-filled place in our world right now, I thought it would be really helpful for us to pause for a moment and learn some strategies from Debbie on how we can go from us and them to we. The concepts tonight, my expectations and hope at the end of our time together here tonight is that we all will use this next hour to pause, to listen, to learn, to show up, and then to walk away with actionable items about how we can not only stand up, but sustain ourselves as upstanders in the fight against racism. So with all of that said, again, I welcome you to tonight's webinar. And I am going to open it up again with thanking Debbie for being here with us tonight. I know that now more than ever, her time is really crunched with everybody wanting to hear about her research and her wisdom. So I am really distinguishedly privileged tonight to have her here with us. So let me start, Debbie, by asking you to begin to unpack this concept with us. Words like racism and anti-racism. Can you begin the conversation with kind of a racism 101 so we're all collectively talking about the terms the same?
Well, thank you, Lori. And I certainly also want to join you in welcoming those of you who are on this call. And I must say I'm a little teary because of that introduction, Lori, in the sense of you are such a outstanding upstander in the true sense of the word. You know, we use that word, it was coined by Samantha Power, who was a former US ambassador under Obama. And if you read her book or know how she pushes, doing the right thing and not just being a bystander. And the term got popularized by the group Facing History and Ourself, the organization, which I'm involved with, and Lori is as well. And so it's such a wonderful way to see you as a role model. We all hold Nana, your grandmother as a teacher and being an upstander. Lori and I were talking today about what Nana's response would have been to the George Floyd situation. And she would have been like this, like with a pillow, like going up there or getting that, just hitting, getting Derek Chauvin off of him because, just pushing herself in there. And so we want to talk about, the ways in which we can be upstanders, the way we can be anti-racist. And so your question about unpacking, what racism is a good start, because first of all, that's, as you know, people have kind of a 1960s or even 1950s understanding of what a racist is, and here's the good news though, is that no one likes to be called a racist. Even racists don't like to be called racist, And so we can use that spirit, that energy that we have for still knowing that that's a horrific term. So what we talk about racism, though, in its modern form, to understand it, when people talk about racism and anti-racism, because racism is one end of the continuum, and there are many forms of racism. And if you read the work of, well, it started with Angela Davis, actually, where she said it's just not good enough just to be not racist. You have to be aggressively anti-racist. And that's Ibram Kendi's notion as well. He wrote the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, where he says that if you're either a racist or an anti-racist. So when we talk about racism in its many forms, I look at it as a 4-box model, and I'm going to say this really quickly because you can go onto my website in the resources and actually pull up this ism matrix, where a racism can be overt, meaning observable and measurable and intentional, such as like the Holocaust or slavery or genocide or Charlottesville. That's what people usually think about racism. But it can also be covert and intentional, like gerrymandering, redlining, hiring practices, housing segregation, employment practices as well. And I think like resume whitening. And that's, I don't have time to unbundle all of those, but that's what we need to know. And then it also can be overt and unintentional, like jokes that people tell, or maybe a Halloween costume, or segregated leisure activities that people aren't intending to be racist, but it's part of our culture. Or it can be covert and unintentional, and that's really slippery, like the microaggressions. People might have heard that term, microaggressions, which means those slight racial slurs that happen, or the racial insensitivities that people have. It could be mentoring practices, hiring practice. The list goes on, and it's there. So in other words, Lori, the continuum is from the racially insensitive all the way to, genocide.
Mm-hmm.
Or destroying, or something like Charlottesville, or what people saw, what's happening in the police culture with George Floyd.
And one of the things that you talk about, and I'm actually going to quote you in one of your writings. You said racism is determined not by intentions, but rather impact. And I think, when I read that, it's such a profound statement that I want you to be able to talk a little bit about the meaning behind that, because for many people, I think, who are watching, who are listening, who are struggling with this, the ways that you've just described between overt and covert actions and belief systems is that it's not my intention to be racist. It's not my intention to say, I just don't want to participate in this. But the impact that my inactivity or my subtle racial slurs or exclusion has an impact. And that really spoke to me. Can you say a little bit more about that sentence?
Sure. Again, as you said, people generally think about racism, or if I'm racist, as a personal prejudice or an attitude. And it's more than that. I think what has happened with George Floyd has given us an opportunity to understand better institutional racism or systemic racism. The fact that the police officer could be there and put his knee on the man's neck until he died, and 3 other officers and a host of other people could stand around and watch, like a modern day lynching, because they couldn't do anything. It was a 17-year-old girl who was actually videotaping it with her phone. Mm-hmm. But it speaks then to a culture, that a culture in the police departments that allows for this to happen, allows for all of those unconscious and conscious biases, all the hiring practices, all of the ways in which, we make laws that benefit the police officer so that they can feel protected if they're going to kill someone. So it is more than just somebody's personal attitude. I used to use this example all the time in teaching, and it's even more appropriate now, and I think relevant. I used to say, if I were to wrestle you to the ground and put my foot on your neck, and then look down at you lovingly and say, oh, Laura, you look like such an interesting person. I would really like you to be my friend. Which one would you pay more attention to? Mm-hmm. My foot on your neck, or my words. And
Mhm.
so intention doesn't always mitigate the impact. And that's where we have to be able to see that. So we can have the intentions and the aspirational thinking, but that doesn't mean that the racist acts that they don't happen.
Mhm. So I think you've probably hit on this, but when we were preparing for the webinar, I had a couple people send me messages saying, I don't know why we're making such a big deal about this. Racism is so much better today. To keep talking about this, it's like one of those taboo topics. We're going to end up fighting. It adds to the division. Why can't we just leave this, that everybody is loving and good and just needs to say, I'm not colorblind. It's all going to be okay, and stop making such a big deal about this.
Yeah. And I think for those of you who are more on the intention side, then it's easy to say it's not such a big deal. When somebody's got your foot on their neck or their knee on your neck and killing you, it is the impact. So we have to be able to understand intention versus impact. We also have to be able to understand that, to your point about making this a big deal, we've been making it a big deal for 400 years. I think that's a reason why people don't understand the looting or the frustration. And if anybody has ever not been angry enough that you just wanted to hit something or then you're privileged. You've had a pretty good life, but you're never just so angry that you want, and so we understand that as psychologists. I think how those frustrations and those angers comes out. I'm not condoning looting, I'm not condoning violence, but it certainly is understandable when you have that kind of pent up for a long, long time, when somebody's not being heard or somebody is recognized, or you have laws that don't support you in this. So it's understanding the history. It's also having the competencies to do this. I happen to know and believe that the reason why most people don't like to talk about it is because, I call them under-functioning anti-racists, that we don't have the skill sets or the competencies. It is truly like if before cell phones, like if somebody, or even with cell phones, if somebody has a car that's disabled on the road and they need help changing a tire, I couldn't stop to help them. I wouldn't know how to do it. That doesn't mean that I'm not an altruistic person or whatever. I don't have those competencies to do that. Similarly, we don't have the diversity competencies to navigate our increasingly complex multiracial world. And so we're using, we just think that if I'm a good person, like you said, or I love God, or I think of people as all God's children, that it's going to translate into good behavior, but it doesn't. We need the competencies like holding multiple realities, perspectives, identity, how to marry intention and impact, how to use our privilege, our social privilege, as a life skill, as a leadership competency, how to make quality decisions in the midst of diversity tension, and how to, just be skilled and facile, around and emotionally resilient when we make mistakes. So we all need to develop those competencies.
Yeah, and I know we're going to get into some of the how do we develop those competencies, because one of the other questions that came in before was somebody saying, when all of this happened, my heart was breaking. I'm a 70-year-old Jewish woman, and I have friends that are African American that take care of my mother, that are like family, and I wanted to call them, but I didn't know what to say. And here's the punchline: I didn't want to sound condescending.
Yeah.
So the struggle and the message, I know there were multiple realities within that of recognizing, maybe even not using the word, the privilege of, if I speak to you in that way, it's as if I'm speaking down and my privilege is showing. Can you talk a little bit about privilege, about white privilege? Because it's a word, just like racism, that makes people bristle, that people don't want to really unpack that word either. And I know that it's imperative, because to become a more just society with better equity for everybody, as white individuals, we have to be able to own some of that. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that is, you gave me probably a $2 million question, and I've got about a two-buck answer. I got a big answer, but it's going to take a lot of time to respond to that because it was very rich. Let me just say to the first part about people feeling they want to do something, but they don't know what to do. I think just being who you are and genuine and putting it out there is important. You know, we got a lot of prescriptive information right now about how whites should behave. Like, don't go to people of color and Black people and tell them you're sorry because that's bad. And then you get other people, you'll hear other writing that says, you can express your sorrow for, this. So people are like, well, what am I supposed to do? And then in the face of that, they get so confused, they don't do anything. Or like you said, I don't want to appear condescending, or I don't want to appear like educating. I think you can say, I just what you just said. I mean, just from the heart. Mm-hmm. I am so saddened by what's going on. I'm also confused, and I'm hurt, and I'm struggling and thinking about white identity right now and what that means. And that's a good thing. And any person who responds negatively to that, then there's something wrong with them, because you have to be able to take that in. Or they can say to you honestly, I'm not ready right now. Mm-hmm. I have a lot of white friends who are calling me, not my really close white friends, but some that I haven't seen in years because they're digging in their Rolodex, or they're on their phone to find their Black friend. And then they call me to say, because they want to talk about this. And I get that, mm-hmm. I get that. But at the same time, I did write an article about why, Blacks aren't ready to come together yet, but I'm confident that we will. I'm confident that we will. So first thing is just to be genuinely yourself, mm-hmm. To talk from your core identity, because that's what we want, core to speak to core. Then privilege, again, privilege like diversity, like racism can be a word that people get tired of hearing. And I think when people think about privilege, they think about the fact of they don't think about social, it's not privilege like I earned something and I have a lot of money, or I didn't have a hard life. It's social privilege. And when we talk about social privilege, we're talking about unearned opportunities, access, laws that benefit a group of people and disadvantage others. And we all have privilege in different dimensions of diversity. As I sit in my beautiful home, I'm looking at your beautiful home. I talked about even having pandemic privilege, how, I could do all of these things. I didn't have to worry about job. I didn't have to worry about, a lot of the things that some people were being concerned of. But I also have class privilege and, age privilege, a lot of other dimensions of social privilege acts the same way. And white privilege, because of the visibility of it, means that there are laws and opportunities and access that you simply have just because of privilege. I always explain it with if you've rented a car, and when you rent the car, you take the car back, there's that sign, that ominous sign that says, do not back up or your tires will get, are you familiar with, you see that?
Yeah. I've never done it, just so you know, but yes, I'm aware.
Yeah, because it makes me really scared, because that sign says, I'm thinking, am I going the right direction? Because those spikes are up there. When you're traveling the world as a white person, you have racial privilege, which means those spikes just lay on down, and you can be confident that if something did happen, those tires did damage your tires, that the rental company would take care of it. Now, people of color, and it usually, and especially in this case, we saw it for Black people, that those tires don't lie down, and we're also trying to always navigate, trying to get that car around with those spikes up there. So what we want to see happen with privilege is that we all use our privilege, for, as I call, a life skill. And if you're in a position of leadership, then you use it as a leadership competency, that you try to make sure that those spikes lie down for everyone, mm-hmm. that everyone has opportunity, access, and it's not attached to skin color, but rather to conditions that we create.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and I think, when I listen to what people are starting to have conversations about of how do I show up, what does it mean to really say, I'm with you? And do I have to feel ashamed? Should I be apologetic for 40 years, for what's been going on for 400 years? And I think, for me, and you can speak to this, showing up is what we started the top of the hour with. It's about showing up with your strengths and your weaknesses, your deficits, your bias, your gifts fully exposed. Because if we don't do that, and I think as I said, I've learned that from you over the 40 years of being in friendship with you, that you can be a racist and an anti-racist all in the same sentence. You know, your actions, your thoughts, which then for me takes the racism word. It's not like a stamp. It's not the big R on everybody's forehead, but rather self-examination and showing up to look at, why do I feel that way? And as I unpack that further, the reality is because I'm holding a racial bias in there that I don't like how it makes me feel about myself. But for me, the concept of showing up is really about, I can't engage with you in a work environment, in a friendship, in a relationship, in community, till I do that deep dive work with myself. Can you speak to that a little bit more about how you think people need to do more of that from both sides of the community?
Absolutely. You know, because you've hit it, you know, I have to work out of my core identity, you know, and that's our lifelong process. I've always said that all of us are a little racist, sexist, homophobic, classic, ageist, et cetera. It's a matter of degree. And our life work then is to rid ourselves of all of that. You know, and I often use the onion as an example of the layers out of which, you know, we tend to act rather than that core. And at the core identity is our humanity, the things that we are, you know, and you know, some people, that's what makes us like godlike, you know, because we at the core of identity. So when our core is speaking to core, you know, and not out of our layers, when I'm looking at you and interacting with you as a human being. Now, how do I want to do that then in showing up? Which means I show up trying to act out of my core, but when I'm raggedy or when I'm acting out of my layers, like you were talking about, I got to own that. And I have to be able to understand that this is hard work. You know, it's not just a matter of having a good attitude or like, you know, saying that I'm a good person, I don't, you know, I'm colorblind. No, because it really is hard work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, you wrote a book when we think about how to show up and how are we going to leverage our relationships really to be able to have that core-to-core conversation. Your book on Some of My Friends Are ... talks about cross-racial friendships. And you know, in the book, you make the argument again of how important these friendships can be to move us along in this divide. And you know, again, I have a bias in that I think women who have very powerful friendships, we hold a lot of power to be able to really advance this conversation through our cross-racial friendships, but they are not easy. Right. So let's talk a little bit about some of the concepts in your book and about, you know, the idea that these cross-racial friendships are so very important to the story that we're trying to tell and the outcome and the impact we're trying to achieve.
Thank you for that, Lori, because, you know, I used to believe as a chief diversity officer and someone who's been in organizations, gosh, over 100 of them, you know, in my professional life doing diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work. And I used to think that that's where we were going to make the difference. And I began to see that that's not, because of issues like structural racism, where we do have laws and policies. And at work, you really don't have egalitarian relationships. You know, if you have a friend, either it's a work friend that's of a different race, you know, and you're doing that, if something happens, you know, it can mess up, you know, your work relationships too. So true friendships, you know, they can start at work. I'm not saying that they don't develop there, but egalitarian relationships where there's not a power differential, where the trust is there, that you can have those honest and deep conversations, or where they're, you know, they are really, I believe, a sure path to healing our racial divide. The problem is that most of us don't have those kinds of relationships, you know, not just the ones that we can, you know, like I used to say, like that you name, like I call them the bubble friends or the fantasy friends, like it's the Pomeranian dog's mom, you know, or the person who sits 3 pews behind you. We don't really know those people. I'm talking about the people you could call at 3 a.m., you know, the people, like one of my focus group persons said, that you could do a number 2 in their bathroom and not worry about it. Those are the close friends that we're talking about, that you can have these really deep, honest conversations about George Floyd and what just happened. You can explain when they say something like, well, isn't it just excessive force, or just a few bad apples, that you can explain to them and say, let me tell you why you got this wrong, and let me explain to you, because that is where those mountains of racism can be moved. And so what we know, though, is that most of us don't have those friendships where we can have those conversations, but there's still other things we can do to start to develop that.
Well, and I think, one of the things that you talk about when it comes to those relationships is, number one, they're hard work, and we know that. And we know that it's not like you just say, oh, I have this friend who's Black, and then accept that means I know somebody who's Black, I have a friend who's Black, but it's not the same level of an intimate relationship that involves the trust. Because it's interesting, I right now we've got people throwing out all kinds of ideas and opinions as if they're facts. When we promoted that we were going to be doing this webinar, and in the introduction I said, and it's going to be my privilege to host one of my longest, dearest, treasured friends. And I don't even think I hit send on Facebook, that the response that came back said, anytime a white woman says she has a Black friend, she's a racist. And so I thought, well, this is interesting, because now we see that we have poked at the bear. These are the beliefs that are floating as if they are facts. And the only way we shift that, based on the information you've shared in your book, is to be able to have not the superficial friendships, but the going deep friendships.
Right. I call those individuals over-functioning anti-racist, that we know, from the marriage and family therapy, where you have under-functioners who tend to, under stress, just, they don't know what to do, they shut down, or they get so nervous, they, have these physiological responses. There are a lot of whites right now who are under-functioning, they don't know how to manage it. But then we have the over-functioners who are quick to come in and fix the solution. They're going to hit everything people say that they think is racist, like a whack-a-mole game, boom, 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 knocking people out. That's not helpful either. We really have to be functioning anti-racist and understand, again, core identity, speaking to, we approach this work with cultural humility, which means it's a lifelong process of self-examination, self-critique. It's what you were talking about before. It's learning and understanding my own racial identity and how I am going to, grow. Because we can't change, we know in psychology, we can't change anybody else's behavior, except our own. And we can only create cultures or climates where they will want to change. So there is a lot of that going on right now. It's like you said, there's a lot of people being very prescriptive of what you do and don't do, but showing up means being, not concentrating on the doing as much as we're concentrating on the being.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, which brings us around the full circle here of, with that sense of authentic courage to show up to ourselves, which I still think we all have a long way to go. Because again, I know it's hard to acknowledge beliefs that we hold that we think are not pretty, or socially acceptable or even likable to ourselves. But once we own that, we can move to the position of what do we do next? How do we engage that and move into action? And so the third part of our webinar tonight was to really talk about how do we stand up? And in preparing for this, you and I were having a conversation about another dear friend of mine who I interviewed for the Put on Your Big Girl Shoes book, Rena Ferber-Finder, who is one of the last remaining Holocaust survivors from Schindler's List. And anybody who's read the book, that interviewing Rena and digesting and taking in and absorbing her message was life-changing for me. And one of the things that Rena talked very strongly about was the danger of indifference, the danger of silence. Now, obviously, we know what happened with the Holocaust, but if we move upstream of that story and we start with, where did it begin? It began with the dehumanization, our language, the things that people were doing to the Jewish population, and others were saying, I don't really think that's a great thing, but I'm not going to rock the boat. I'm not getting involved. I'm going to stay, like I'm Switzerland again. That silence became the seed of allowing the catastrophic ending of what happened with the Holocaust. So I hear that word always in my head about the danger of silence, the danger of being indifferent and going, listen, that's got nothing to do with me. Let them figure it out. Is it ultimately turns and affects all of us in some way. So moving from the danger of being indifferent and being a bystander, I think about what must the other officers been thinking as they stood there and watched. And as I listened to Rena's stories, thinking about people who watched children being shot while they were taking their children off to school, wondering again, what do we have to tell ourselves in order to remain a bystander? And then how do we pivot and go, no, it's not okay for me to just say this hurts me and it's not okay. I have to move from a bystander to being an upstander, to standing up and saying this might not be popular, it might put me at risk, but I will no longer be silent. Talk about what can those of us who are feeling so helpless, who want to be part of this solution, how do we move from being a bystander and developing those competencies that you've been talking about to being an upstander in this process?
Yeah. And I'm glad you put that out there like that, because we do get paralyzed. As I said, we get paralyzed when we don't know what to do and then do nothing. The other thing is that when we have a culture that all of us have all those social loadings that's in our head about what we should do, think, and believe, that's how all those biases get in there. That's how all the racism happens, and it's intentional on many people's parts. When we tend to treat differences as a threat to be feared, rather than trying to manage differences as a competency, to be mastered, or as a skill to be mastered, then that's when we're off, because as long as you're working from a fear-based model, then you are going to act just like everybody else did. If you start to look at, instead of a threat to be feared, it's something that we just have to manage difference as a competency to be mastered, then we're on the right path. But it's logical. I use this like the hourglass as an example as well. What's happened now is that we have whites who are the ones who get to make all the laws, practices, benefits, etc. for them. That's what privilege is about, and, they get to mess on people, people of color. And because we're coming out of a fear model, then people are concerned about, all we're going to do is flip that hourglass, and now people of color are going to do the same things to whites. And so that's a self-preservation. And what we want to do, as I always say, is to try to level that playing field, so that we crack this bottle, so that there aren't those barriers. We're all talking as humans, as one race, the human race, but that is not a simple concept, and we do have to learn those competencies in order to do that. One is understanding our racial identity, piece, who we are as racial beings. And there's, that's a whole process when we've learned about our intellectual development, social development, all of physical development. We don't learn about racial development. We need to do that, So racial identity development is one. Am I supposed to be talking now about like what we can do? Is that what you want?
Yeah, I think that would be great, because I think that moving from a place of feeling helpless to give me something tangible that I can develop that racial identity, that I can understand what systemic racism is, for people who are saying, I don't get it. Everybody's got a fair shot. It's just, if you want to be lazy, then nothing good's going to come of it. It's, again, that whole circular narrative that we keep telling ourselves, that until we educate ourselves better about what does systemic racism mean, how is that translated, what are the actionable things we can do to start to learn about something that all too well about.
Right now, I don't think we have the luxury of willful ignorance anymore. Whites don't, because one of the things that we know is that, people of color, particularly Blacks, aren't as committed anymore to whites' comfort, you know. So willful ignorance, just saying, well, I didn't know that, I didn't understand that, is not going to help, you know. So there are things that you can do. First of all, engaging in multiracial living, you know, and that means where you choose to live, where you shop, organizations that you support, where you get your information from, and who you choose to believe, all of that. And I don't mean you have to, run out and buy a new home in a racially mixed neighborhood, but you can do multiracial living by just being more aware of other opportunities that are there. Reading, I have on my website, and I just put out, even before George Floyd happened, 6 books that I recommended that you could read and discuss to achieve racial equity. And I picked 5 areas, or 5 areas in which we have racial inequity. One's a criminal justice system. So if you haven't read Just Mercy, that's one.
It's a great book.
Disparities. We don't have a lot of, really non-academic books about healthcare disparities, but if you read Black Man in a White Coat, which is a wonderful memoir story, Doctor's Reflection on Race and Medicine, Damon Tweedy. These are all on my website. The Color of Money, which talks about the wealth gap. So this is healthcare disparities. This is the wealth gap. Black banks and the racial wealth gap. Education, achievement gap. We Want to Do More Than Survive, which is Bettina Love's book on education, really good. Voter suppression, One Person, One Vote. One Person, No Vote. It's a really good book, too, by Carol Anderson, to understand, and this one, to understand housing segregation, The Color of Law, and how it is today. So, I mean, and there are lots of good reading lists that are out there now. That's one way to do that. The other thing that I recommend when we're talking about friendships, Lori, and how we could do, one of the things I hope people will do is to just sit down and just reflect on your hopes and concerns that you have for race equity moving forward now. And a hope is something that you want to see happen, and a concern is something that you don't want to see happen, but there's a probability that it might. And so put down that list, get a list of hopes and concerns, then find your friend of a different race, or if you don't have one, choose a coworker and just say, listen, I've got this reflection of my hopes and concerns. I'd like to discuss this with you. That's always a good conversation starter. And then put down your takeaways from that. Then, of course, another thing that we can all do is vote, and vote for candidates and ask them, what is their stance on racial equity? What are they doing to make a more racial, just, and inclusive society?
Yeah. And I think that, as you talk about, my hope is that as people leave the webinar tonight, that they not only do the reading and educating, because again, that makes us drill down deeper in terms of our awareness. So the things that we are talking about comes from a place of being educated and knowing the things that maybe we don't really want to know, but it's the starting place. And then I love the idea of having that conversation with other people, because I know how hard and how painful those conversations can be. But anybody who wants growth within themselves, growth in their relationships, or the opportunity to have a seat at the table to be part of the solution, as opposed to just feeling so sad and overwhelmed and saying, oh my God, what's happened to our world? It's so divided. We can be an important part of bridging that divide. And I'm going to just add, because I know we're at time here to open this up to Q&A, but to all of our viewers out there who are watching today, I have to say, I have great hope in not only my generation, because that hope's getting a little bit smaller, but in the generations that come, my children's generation and their generation, I believe that the generations coming down the pike are more interested and willing to purge themselves of some of the old way of thinking and really actively engage in more self-awareness and more inclusive communities. And so that gives me great hope. And when I saw some of the 20-some-year-old males joining our group tonight and people from a variety of backgrounds, I thought these are the people who are taking time out of their day to put their money where their mouth is, to say, I want to be part of the solution. So I, again, applaud all of you who are here with us tonight, doing the work that it takes to get us to a more inclusive, equitable life. So let me pause there, because I think Holly maybe has some questions that Dr. Plummer here has to answer for us.
First, I agree we need to be able to discuss together without feeling defensive, but it seems like our political environment shuts off any different point of view. How do we change that?
If I could say, and I think that's true. And what we have to understand about politics is really about power, you know. And when we talk about our democracy, that's the peaceful exchange of power. So what's happening now is that our democracy is being threatened because we don't have that peaceful exchange and interchange of power. And so we have to know that when we have populist thinking is, Lori, what you were even talking about, with people just thinking, if I've read it or if I think it or if I've lived it, that makes it the fact and that makes it the reality. And we have to come back to knowing that subjective reality is not necessarily, the historical fact, or it's not um, empirical facts, which means data that we can prove, that's generalizable, that goes from science. So I think if we all, first of all, we have a lot of work to do in order to change our political climate, which starts by, again, really holding people accountable for their vote. We cannot just vote we can vote in our own interest, but knowing that if I vote just because of the economy or just because something that's important to me, that all of these things are interconnected. Look at the pandemic. We're all experiencing this public health crisis. That virus doesn't care what color, how much money you have, et cetera. But we all have to work together to solve this. But it's disproportionately affecting Black people because of systemic racism. So it is all intertwined. So one of the things that we can do is vote responsibly, and not just at the highest level, but our local levels are real important, because those are the judges, the local officials that have. So we just have to really educate ourselves, hold people accountable, and vote. That's what I would say. I don't know, Lori, if you have something else.
No, I think you're spot on with that. I think, when people start to feel, anytime we know as psychologists, helplessness comes from a place of, I don't have the tools and I don't know what I need to do next. And then we can get sunk into a place of depression and despair, and then disengagement. Like, I don't care about any of the candidates. Politics is toxic. I don't want to participate. But now's the time again to do that pivot from, if you do nothing and you don't vote and you don't educate yourself about that process, you are essentially contributing to the problem as a bystander. So I see it all intertwined in that same way.
Okay. Next, Attorney General William Barr said there is no systemic racism in policy. He says most of our history, our institutions were explicitly racist. Does he just not understand what systemic racism is? He says there are instances of bad cops. How can we explain the full reason why we are protesting against cops when their minds are thinking this way?
Great question.
That is a very good question. I think I want to say that systemic racism is hard to understand in its complexity, but Attorney General Barr knows better. So, he's an attorney. Any attorney that denies systemic racism, I don't know how they got their law degree, truly, because systemic racism, means that, again, there is embedded in the law, in the practices, in the policies, and even how they are implemented, racism. If you read that book, The Color of Law, you understand housing segregation. You know, with with every single. If you read One Person, No Vote, you understand voter suppression, despite the laws. There is systemic racism. So I think we have to be really savvy and astute and critical thinkers
Mhm.
of what information we are getting currently from our leaders, so that we don't swallow everything whole and go into an authoritarian, autocratic society, because that's what it is. Democracy is just that. We can criticize our leadership. We can go out there and protest, peaceful protest. We can say that doesn't make any sense, and we can keep hammering for accountability. So I do think that that has contributed to our culture. That I'm not sure if I hit the actual part of the question. I'd have to look at it again because it is so important. But when people say that, they have their own agenda. I think it's about, their own agenda.
Yeah. And just as a psychologist, I would certainly add that I think there's this phenomena that happens of denial is really at the core of all of this. That, if I don't want to see this problem, it's easier to get into the black and white thinking, meaning not necessarily racial black and white, but the all or nothing thinking. It's either the laws are discriminatory or they're not, as if there's no gray place that we can go, yes, but this is tied to this and it has this ripple effect. But people have to really be able to step out of their denial to be willing to even see that.
We know that that's terribly hard to do. So we're just going to have to be very smart about this, because truly, I, I, I think that, this is about power and greed. That's the agenda, so, and I can say that they'll probably use all of this civil unrest as, first of all, calling it thugs, concentrating on the looting and the destruction of small businesses and all of these things, rather than noting that the first act of violence was the knee on George Floyd's neck. And if we want to go back further, the acts of violence for 400 years against Blacks, as Tamara Mallory, the activist, said, truly, we learned looting from you, meaning whites. You looted the country when you first came in here, call it United States, and looted it from the Native Americans. The violence of lynching, go to Montgomery, Alabama, and look at Brian Stevenson's, the work there, and the lynching museum. That is so, so, we can't just say, look at the violence now. This is like a domino effect. So A happens, then B happens as a result of that, and then C happens, and we pretend like A doesn't happen and just talk about B and C. Look at their rioting, and then they're looting and doing all this stuff. Where A was the knee on George Floyd's neck, which cost the life of a man. Ahmaud Arbery, before that, Breonna Taylor, all within this 9 months, and we can go on and on and on. So let's not forget the catalyst for all of this. Let's not forget the start.
I'm working with organizations in the Cleveland that are and have been trying to make real differences in communities with large percentages of African Americans. The idea of defunding police budgets is just anathema to our efforts. Thoughts about this new policy idea?
Well, first of all, I think we have to understand what they mean by defunding the police. I think it's like when Black Lives Matter came out, and then people will say, well, all lives matter. Well, they were getting a catchy, like a phrase to start it. They could have said Black Lives Matter too, or Black Lives Matter also, because what was happening that, yes, all lives matter, but Blacks weren't included in there. It's like everybody else was eating and we weren't eating. And so we're saying, hey, we want to eat too, It's not that we are hungry and then people say, oh, well, all of us are hungry. That was the point. I think when they're saying defund the police, they're saying, as Kamala Harris just talked about today, we have to reimagine a whole police culture. And many times you start from scratch. So it's not that we're abolishing the police officers, it's redistributing funds so that they get at the root cause of what's happened to police. You know, what's happening for police officers. And there are many police officers who understand this, because police now are, they're obligated to do everything. Mental illness, take care of the mental ill, the homeless. We police everything. We over police in this society. You know, it's just like with our educators. We expect them to be the therapist, the parent, you know, we put them in the classroom, but we give them everything. We give them all of our social ills, and the same thing we do with police. So what they're meaning by defund the police is to take those funds, reimagine them, redistribute them, look at what the police needs, and go back to community policing, where it is about protecting and serving, and redistribute it to those agencies that could help more with mental illness, homelessness, you know, all of those things. Yeah, those social service agencies, it's not like give it completely to them, but let's talk about what makes sense.
Okay. Dr. Plummer shared a lot about various competencies. Do you happen to have those on your website?
I believe so. There are 5 that I promote, and I think, and I'll go back, but if when we talk at the end, there's a resource list. So I talk about using our privilege as a life skill, you know, and I often teach about it as using it as a leadership competency for those. That's 1. Holding multiple realities, identities, and perspective. You know, moving from certainty to curiosity. And that's what I think, you know, Lori, that we were talking about. People have to do that. You know, the world has changed, and, you know, we also are not so certain about anything. So just being curious. So moving from certainty to curiosity, making quality decisions in the midst of diversity tension. There will always be tension when there's diversity, but we have to make creative tension around it. And of course, anytime I do 5, I always can't then remember the 4th one to start. So, you know, but they're there. When I mention those, you know, they're there. I believe they are on the website. If not, they're in a little book called Advancing Inclusion, and it's geared towards employee resource groups, but it's really the basics. The first part of it is all about basic diversity stuff that we need to know, and all of those diversity competencies are in there. And that one's priced. It's $99. It's real, you know, so that you can get that anywhere. But yes, it can be there or easily accessible.
And we are at the end of the hour going to make sure that there's a link in the show notes for the resources that Debbie talked about, her website, a link to blogs where she outlines and talks in more detail about the topic. So at the end of our Q&A session here, we will absolutely have that included in the show notes, because we are recording this, and we'll redistribute. So I know that's Holly's job, is to keep us, I'm pointing down like it's what is it? Not Family Circle, Brady Bunch. Holly down here will make sure that we are on point with that. So do we have time for one more question, Holly?
Okay. As a nurse whose patients are mostly Black, how can I help bridge the gap of inequalities that we know exist in medical care for the Black communities?
Wow, that's a heavy one.
I think, first of all, thank you. You know, I think nurses, especially during this time, lots of applause to you, you know, for the care that you are providing. And I think inherent in what you're doing, you know, is taking care of making sure that they have equal access, and the treatment outcomes are, you know, getting what they need, because healthcare disparities is about access to healthcare. It is about treatment outcomes, you know, and having positive, and the delivery of the healthcare delivery, those 3 areas: healthcare delivery, access to the healthcare, and treatment outcomes. And so nurses have a big role, particularly around the healthcare delivery, and do a good job of that. So I think you can see, you know, that the what you're doing naturally This health is really supporting healthcare delivery. Healthcare disparities. So don't underestimate what you're already doing.
And I'll just add a little teeny piece to that in knowing that now with COVID, that our healthcare workers, our nurses are being asked to not only deliver the services, but to be the surrogate emotional family member for the person who might be, you know, potentially at risk for dying, is isolated and scared and alone. And I think, you know, when you add COVID on top of the racial struggles that are happening right now and the division, your job as a healthcare worker, I think, taking all of the information perhaps that you've heard tonight, wrapping some of that information around the care that you're providing, and maybe seeing the patient through a different lens to know that their struggle is unique in many ways. So Holly has now flipped up on the screen here, which is her way of saying we are at the top of the hour. And this slide is reflecting some of the links as to where you can get in touch with Dr. Plummer, with myself. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we will definitely have a link to a lot of resources that Dr. Plummer talked about tonight. So with that, in respect of your time that you've spent here with us today, I want to thank Dr. Plummer for her time and her wisdom and her commitment to moving all of us from us and them to a collective we. And I thank each and every one of you for being here with us tonight and your commitment to becoming an anti-racist and then sustaining it. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.